Anyway, so they give their perspective on the first decades and how they experienced. We have lots of interesting anecdotes. However, each and every one of you should contribute something too, right? You only have an hour, right? But here's a good question for you. Suppose we could turn time back using a nice time machine to 1983. So it happened that some of these folks, like Nicholas and Ned and Václav, I'm not sure about Václav, but Nicholas and Ned for sure, they were there in 1983 in Monterey when the first CSM conference was held. It was actually called the Workshop on Software Maintenance Workshop at the time, the first one. Suppose we could turn back time. Given all the knowledge you have today about the software industry, everything you know, research and practice, with respect to software maintenance, software evolution, what advice would you give those pioneers? Right here. What advice would you give those pioneers? How they should act, how they should influence the field, how they should direct the field. What advice would you give to them? Think about that while you sit here for an hour and listen to them. Chances are, the advice you come up with, given the state of software maintenance and evolution and software in general, software engineering over the last 30 years, chances are the advice you come up with is still valid today. As a result, you could change history for the next 30 years. And some of these pioneers were asking yesterday, okay, so when do we meet next and where do we meet? And I said, of course, Victoria. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to turn over the microphone to Nicholas Zvegintzov. He was General Chair of the second CSM, second conference in the CSM series in 1985, which was in Washington, D.C. There we go. He was the editor of Software Management News for many years. Nicholas, I really saw him as a maintenance tool evangelist, and also saw him as a Y2K anti-evangelist. Nicholas.
Thank you, Hazy. Well, I think, in fact, I'm the only person physically here who was at the 1983 workshop. Bob Arnold was also there, and he has sent his avatar to talk to us. Before anything else, I would like to pay tribute to Dr. Norm Schneiderwin, who more or less single-handedly founded this workshop. Schneiderwin had the concept of such a workshop in 1982, both the necessity of it and the idea of holding it. He got authorization for it from the IEEE Computer Society. He secured a venue at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, gathered people to work on it and to contribute to it from his considerable network of contacts in software engineering, the military, and academia, and managed them through it with tenacity, vision, tact, and good humor. He had unique resources at a unique moment, and he used them well. The workshop took place at NPS in December 1983. It was a financial and an intellectual success, and it was the root of all the subsequent CSM's, Conference on Software Maintenance, ICSM's International Conference, and now Evolution that followed and still flourish. And here we are today. I tried to invite him to this conference, but I found that he is in a nursing home. and cannot come. I'm sorry. But let's pause and give him a round of applause to tell him thank you. I hope you can transmit that to him. The time of the 1983 conference was a time of the rise to consciousness of maintenance in all of the software community. In 1980 appeared Girish Parikh's Techniques of Program and System Maintenance, the first American book on software maintenance. The influential trade weekly Computer World had special articles on maintenance in 1981. In fall 1983, about the same time as the workshop, the Joint Logistics Commanders Biannual Workshop was themed, quote, Post-Deployment Software Support. William Perry of the Quality Assurance Institute was holding his second national conference on EDP system maintenance. In 1983, consultant Chris Miller's structured retrofit maintenance tool was sold to a Big 8 accounting firm for consulting use, and toolmaker Bill Morgan announced a competing superstructure tool. Software renovation technology was founded to market a static analysis tool originally created at Arnold. The first issue of the newsletter Software Maintenance News came out. Guidance on software maintenance was issued by the National Bureau of Standards, co-authored by Roger Martin and Wilma Osborne, both subsequently chairs of the CSM conference. And Bob Arnold, hi Bob, had the first, or maybe one of the first, PhDs granted at the University of Maryland for a maintenance topic. In 1980, also, Girish Parikh and I started to edit a book of readings on software maintenance, which was published in 1983 as the tutorial on software maintenance. We found Manny Lehman's once secret 1969 IBM report, which noted the regular growth of the OS 360 operating system. And we also found the first US-sponsored research from 1973, Richard Overton's, quote, a study of fundamental factors underlying software maintenance problems. Final report. Do I hear laughter? We talked to all these writers, and it seemed in 1980, all so long ago, before we had ever thought of maintenance, that we were surprised that they were alive at all. I expect you have the same feeling. How did all this bubble up at this time? If software began in, let's say, 1955, then 1970 was 15 years on, and 1980 was 25 years on. Time enough to learn that software never dies, it just grows and changes. So it's exciting to be here 60 years on into the growth of software and to learn more of the answer. And I look forward to seeing you all again. And Hazi tells me that we'll all be able to meet in 2044 in Victoria, British Columbia. All right, I'll see you then.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So next up is Bob Arnold. He was the workshop record editor of the first workshop in Monterey. He was program co-chair in Washington, D.C. and program co-chair in Austin, Texas for the second and third CSM, and general chair in '88 in Phoenix. He was chair of the first CSM steering committee. He edited several books on tutorial and software maintenance topics. He profoundly, with these books, influenced my PhD, which finished in 1986. I read his books on re-engineering, in particular, the big, thick re-engineering book, religiously, and I'm sure it influenced people like Ken and Scott Tilley and Peggy Story also very deeply. Bob, it's your stage.
Thank you very much, Ozzy. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling in today from Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. And first, I want to thank Housing Mueller very much for inviting me to participate on the panel. And I want to greet my fellow panel session members, all of whom have played a really important role in the evolution of this conference. And I also want to greet you, too, the attendees of this conference. Thank you for coming. So today, I've been asked to speak for about 5 minutes to address some questions about the early years of CSM. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this acronym CSM that stands for the Conference on Software Maintenance, and that was the early acronym for this conference, which is now ICSME. And I'll get into some of the name evolution in a moment. So the questions I'm going to talk about very briefly are what motivated me to get involved with CSM, how did CSM start, and what's the story behind the CSM name change in the early years, and how did the program start? How did the CSM steering committee start? And let's make some remarks about the conference's evolution, which I find very nice. So first, what got me motivated with CSM, getting involved with CSM? Well, I just done my PhD and dissertation in computer science in the topic of software maintenance at the University of Maryland in '83. The topic came up, and just like all of you folks, I was very interested in staying involved with the research in the community, and so I naturally wanted to come and be involved. Let's talk about the conference name evolution and its beginnings. Nicholas has already nicely discussed the 1983 workshop. I was they published a proceedings which was given to the attendees only, and then I was asked to edit a book to be published for the general public, and that book was called The Software Maintenance Workshop Record. There's some interesting things. I had a skiing accident just prior to going to the conference, so I came there with my arm in a cast. It was my writing arm. So I was taking notes literally in my mind. And it turned out I remembered a lot more than I thought I would. Also, when I did the workshop record, I used a typewriter and a Macintosh 128K with no hard drive. So the CSM series of conferences basically started with the 83 conference. And then we move on to CSM 85. And that's where we really got more involved with ICCS and, in my mind, kind of creating a series of conferences under that aegis from then on, even though ICCC was certainly involved with the 83 conference. Norman Schneiderwin does mention Conference on Software Maintenance, that name in the record, because I checked. So it definitely came out, but was finally solidified with CSM 85. How he mentioned to me the term evolution came up and says Conference on Software Maintenance, say Conference on Software Evolution. I do remember a conversation, but I don't remember the specifics about that. Continuing on now with the 85 conference, that was spearheaded by Roger Martin and Wilma Osborne with which was then called the National Bureau of Standards, and that's now called NIST. And they work, of course, with the IEEE Computer Society. I agreed to serve as the program co-chair with Wilma Osborne. Roger, Wilma, myself, and the IEEE-CS were all located in the Washington, D.C. area, and that facilitated meeting and planning. Realizing in those days that email was primarily through your employer. We didn't have cell phones. We used the mail a lot. We had to physically things around. So things were a lot different back then than they were now. We initially toyed with the idea of CSM followed by a sequential number like CSM-1, -2, and so on. But it was decided to say CSM 85, which was the last 2 digits of the year. So that convention changed later on. The conference program patterning was along the lines of the IEEE-CS Computer Society conferences at that time. Conference location, it evolved. At first, we tried to alternate U.S. coasts for the location, and then it was later more in the alternate North American coast, which means you saw it going to Montreal in 1993 and Victoria in 1994. The first international conference software maintenance was in Sorrento, Italy in 1991, and the term international was added to the IEEE, to the CSM acronym making it the International Conference on Software Maintenance. That was added in June 1993 by the steering committee. Some things I'm not sure about are when you started using the full 4-digit year, so you said like we are now, say ICSME 2014, and when the term evolution was added to the acronym ICSME. I think how they can say that is fairly recent. Now let's move on to the next question, the IEEE Steering Committee. The CSM Steering Committee. Its original purposes were to provide a continuing committee to represent CSM interests with the IEEE Computer Society, to improve CSM and adjust it as needed, to guide CSM conduct, to obtain feedback about CSM for purposes of improving it, to assist as needed with the current CSM, to start new CSMs by picking general chairs and program chairs, to pick sites, and to hear appeals for complaints about the conduct of CSM. I drafted the charter with the help of other people, and it was adopted at CSM 91. The steering committee formally was started on October 15, 1991 at the Conference of Software Maintenance in Sorrento, Italy. The member terms were for 2 years, and the chair term was for 1 year. And I'm pleased to say that I believe 3 of the original steering committee members are on this at this meeting. I'm one of them, Malcolm Munro and Václav Rajlich. So finally, what I'd like to say is, I've kind of, when I first talked to Housey about the conference, he was telling me all the changes, and it was very gratifying to see all the things that have happened. So I'm just so amazed this thing has really gone on. It's still very strong after 30 years. That's terrific. It's become a truly international conference, which I'm pleased to see. Also, the stature of the conference has Housey tells me has improved greatly. Realize in the early days, ICSE, the International Conference on Software Engineering, that's the flagship conference of that time. It still is, as far as I know. And CSM was kind of an unknown quantity. It was there, but the general community wasn't necessarily directing all their best work to that conference to get published and hopefully get tenure or something like that. That has changed. According to Housey, it's really become itself a top-tier conference. I'm very pleased to see the repeated strong leadership, the leadership growth, and the consistent maintenance community interest that we have now. That's terrific. And finally, I'd like to say I look forward to another 30 years of successful ICSME conferences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Now, I have the great pleasure to introduce to you the most prolific writer of the first decade of CSM, Malcolm Munro. He is a member, as Bob just said, of the first steering committee, co-chair in San Diego and Sorrento, and is part of this Durham maintenance dynasty.
Thanks, Housey. Yes, my name is Malcolm Munro. The question I would like to try and answer in my 5 minutes is why research in software maintenance? And you'll see why I bring that up when I get on a bit later. The idea of doing research in software maintenance came to us while we were drinking, as usual, beer in a pub called the Victoria in Durham City. And the we is myself, Keith Bennett, Dave Robson, and Barry Cornelius. And we've just arrived at the Department of Computer Science in Durham, and we were looking for some research to do to establish ourselves as world leaders. So we were looking for a hole in the research market, if you like. We were academics, but we decided that there were hundreds of people developing new methodologies for this, that, and the other to develop software quicker and faster and whatever, but nobody had set up a group to research into software maintenance. So after a few pints, we went ahead and said, let's do it. So we did. So what did we do first? Well, of course, we told our fellow academics across the UK that this is what we were doing, and they all laughed. And they all said things like, well, what will you do next year when you've solved all of the software maintenance problems? But we ignored them. But of course, with that sort of attitude, we couldn't get research grants, because as soon as we put in a research grant proposal, it was turned down because it was of no consequence to man or beast. So one of the things that we did is we set up a yearly workshop, which I think ran for 10 years and was open to industry participants only. We put a price on it, so I think we had a 2 or 3 day workshop, and we priced it such that academics could not afford to come. Industry loved it. We used to get 100 people come to Durham. Now, you might think, well, that's not very many, but Durham City is a very small city. We were unknown in any academic research, but we used to get, as I said, at least 100 people paying quite a lot of money, enjoying themselves, because we used to give away the beer. So we had lots of good discussions, lots of good presentations, and we got lots of good feedback. But one of the things that it did allow us to do is that we made a profit from these workshops, which we then ploughed back into sponsoring PhD students. So it got us off on the academic ladder, if you like. So once we'd established that, and we were starting to publish papers, and we got involved with the Conference on Software Maintenance. Once we'd established that, the software engineering community, the academic software engineering community, I should say, in the UK started to take notice of us. And we started to get research grants, so we could do even more research. And I have a slide somewhere, I think it's called grant. Yeah, right. So I was looking through some of my old records a while back, and you see this slide, and it's out of focus. It's deliberately out of focus for a number of reasons. One reason is that a lot of our research was in collaboration with some industrial partners, and of course they didn't want us to reveal anything about their software. So all the names in there you can't read, so we deliberately took things out of focus. But also, and this graph can represent anything you like. I know what it means, but what it shows is that actually if you'd like to see it as all the topics that we could possibly research in software maintenance. And so I've covered in some things that we actually went ahead and researched into. But you'll also notice top left of that, everything seems to go there. And so we started to investigate whatever that point was. And this is where we managed to produce lots of interesting research. But the other issue about that graph is that what I'm hoping is that within those 30 years, some of those things have come into focus, and it's your job to make the whole graph come into focus over the next however many years you want to do it. So there is a madness behind my out of focus graph, in that hopefully it will inspire you to try and say, yes, there are lots of interesting topics in software maintenance to do, and when I mean software maintenance, I also include evolution. And I think we finally made our point to the UK academic software engineers, but we also made software maintenance and evolution a respected, or we helped to make it a respected discipline within the academic community. And one of the things that we used to discuss is, we're doing all this research on software maintenance and evolution. Will we ever have a theory of software maintenance and evolution? Will there be something that will clean up all of this mess, and one day we can walk away from it and say, yes, we've finished? So my closing remark is, do you think at some point we will get our Einstein along somewhere who will produce us a nice theory of software maintenance and evolution, and we can say, good, let's move on and do something else? Thank you.
Hello. So I'm Ken Wong, co-moderator for this panel, and you'll probably be hearing a lot of little facts and snippets. You know, it's like, which year was the very first series of, in the series events, right? Which year was it? Okay, some people have been listening, some people have been slow on the draw. There's going to be a contest tonight at the banquet. So, the table actually gets the most answers is going to win a prize. Or the people at that table win a prize. Don't start shifting around people when the table. So what we're going to have is basically a kind of handout, and you sort of fill those questions. And listen very carefully, because a lot of the answers are in their addresses. And if you can't find them in those addresses, they're also online. Okay, so that's one thing. Another point I want to make is that we often talk about software systems and we want to make them well documented and things like that, but our conferences, are they well documented themselves? Okay, that's kind of an issue because, for example, it was actually very hard to get the very first proceedings. If you go online, it's not there. Okay, so we're trying to complete the record of the conference to kind of get everything on there, including a lot of stuff that's been gathered on the website here. And kind of in terms of documentation and recording what goes on at conferences, Nick Chapin's been doing a lot of that in the early decade. In fact, he's published a number of reports in the first CSMs. They're chief past for general software maintenance, and he's still involved in the maintenance community. You've seen him in Misoka. He's around pretty much in every other ICSM event. And he published 6 papers in the first decade. And then?
Thank you. Yes, I've been active in the computer field since I published my first book in the field in 1954, which is about 60 years ago. I'd like to focus on a few items of the history of the first decade of this conference. One point that I would like to point out is that there was very little international participation during the first years. It wasn't until 90 when people were saying, the meeting was held in San Diego, California, how come we see so many Japanese here today? And it turned out that a party of Japanese people in the Japanese Society on Software Maintenance had decided to come to the conference to see what these Americans were doing. So ever since that time, we've had active foreign, non-USA that is, and non-Canada portion present in the conference. The first one conference, as was mentioned earlier, that we held away from the USA was in Sorrento, Italy, and that was the conference known as, referred to as the 91 conference, because it was in 1991, so 1991. Looking at the conferences during that first 10 years, you see there was a growing attendance and recognition of status. And every year, almost every year, we had a higher attendance than we had in the previous year. Also, the size of the proceedings got larger every year because the number of papers that were accepted for contribution in the conference kept increasing. That increase kept on going past the first century, past the first 10 years, first decade, into the second decade, and swelled up to later. Some other speakers here will probably mention, my notes indicate that the maximum, biggest was in around the year 1999. Also, we noticed there was added university participation in the conferences in the first decade. And that university participation has continued, as has been illustrated here as far as our previous speaker, Malcolm. Also, we added more financial support because as the conference got bigger, it got more costly to find a place to hold the meetings. So they needed support. So they relied on industry support. But it was also notable that the National Bureau of Standards dropped out back in 1984 and never got back in again. So that the Naval Postgraduate School that had been active in 84 and getting things going in 83 also dropped out. But now Norman Schneiderman still was participating, but only at a distance and more occasionally. Some trends I think that were worthwhile noting for the first decade also are worth commenting on. One, the initial emphasis tended to be on the robustness of software and on the difficulties of coding in various languages and having to work with a situation where different code was used, some commercial, some written within the organization, and getting them to interact and work together. Then also another thing that was notable was there was an increasing emphasis during the decade on management of the software investment, because it turned out that when you look closely at where we were spending money on software, it mostly was on maintenance. We also noticed that there was during this time more emphasis on the changes in technology. The changes in technology rippled off into software field, but only slowly. The hardware field moved more rapidly. And we had to often try to change the software to keep up with the changes in the hardware. And that made additional complications which added to the cost of doing and maintaining the software. There was, however, during this time period, relatively little emphasis on two things which still tend to plague us today. One is that we forget too easily that the users of the software in our organizations are effectively our customers. And do we treat them the same way of courtesy and attention that we give the outside customers in the organizations we work for? The users of the software in an organization are very critically important, but are they being listened to? But at the same time, we also know from our experience in working in organizations that an organization is a place where there's a lot of infighting typically going on for people trying to get promotions, get additions to their paychecks, for example, to rise to a different place in the organization. And organizational groups are in turn liking to build silos. But each silo that is built tends to isolate the software in that, or used in that silo, from other portions of the organization. That in turn makes the operation of the organization's software as a whole more difficult. And that was still, it started back in that first decade and has continued even to today. But let me turn you back to our conference chair.
Thanks, Nick. Next up is Lee White. He's a long-time CSM steering committee member and chair. In fact, he was the general chair of the 1994 ICSM in Victoria. So 20 years ago, he was the general chair at the time. Who was here at that event?
I was there.
Okay, a few people still around. And so he spearheaded a number of changes, like for example, the change to ICSM. And he authored the second most cited paper in the first decade, 297 citations. And he published 5 CSM papers in the first decade. Other details, he was also past departmental chair at University of Alberta, where I am. Actually, a little bit before me, but he often visits, so we kind of see him a number of times. In fact, he was there in Edmonton 5 years ago for the ICSM event. So let's hear Lee.
So what I'd like to do is, since I was chair at that conference, I'd like to just mention just a few points. First one is interesting, and that is, where are you now? This is the Victoria Conference Center, and it's exactly the same venue that we used 20 years ago. It was available then, and it was just as spectacular. For the reception that you'll be going to on Thursday night, that will be held at the British Columbia Museum of Natural History. And if you haven't already visited, it's wonderful. We're going to have the reception there on Thursday night, just as we did 20 years ago. So it's kind of interesting that those are repeated venues.
And another 30 years from now, of course.
But the whales still be there. Okay. Now there were some real issues raised 20 years ago when the conference was scheduled here. A number of people were raising questions about it, long distance, how convenient it's going to be, and all this. Well, let me tell you, housing beat the bushes. And we had lots of Canadians, and he convinced lots of Americans to come, and Europeans as well. And we had well over 200, 220 or something like that. 40. 240? 240. And that was one of the largest, or perhaps the largest number in that decade. And so we did very well. Believe me, the policy deserves a little credit. And he tells me that this year we have well over 300. So much for the naysayers. We did very well. Now, I might mention a couple of themes, but I'm not going to mention as many as the keynote this morning, or we'd be here all afternoon. One theme that was clearly emphasized a lot was object-oriented programming. Okay, and it was developing and being utilized and applied all over the place, as opposed to functional design. I want to say something more a little later. And on the other hand, of course, now we know that something was followed in object-oriented programming, namely Agile systems. And Agile systems is getting a good foothold for those applications for which it makes good sense. The other thing that I'll mention is GUI systems. GUI systems didn't exist forever. They were certainly increasing in popularity during that conference, and there was a lot of discussion and papers about that. On the other hand, I need to remind you that at that time, in the early days, they were designed by hand, and it was a particularly tedious process. Each GUI object had to be designed individually by that computer software engineer. Now, of course, there are automatic systems, so you simply feed in whatever GUI objects you want, and the characteristics, the constraints, and whatever, and will come not only the design, but the implementation. So that's changed. I would also like to give you a bit of a challenge today. First of all, engineering and science are not perfect. We have seen lots of occurrences where new ideas have difficulty breaking into the status quo. I'll just pick up one that was in the news some time ago, and that is researchers in the area of Alzheimer's spent 5 years, the first 5 years, on major research looking at the wrong problem. Namely, they were worried about the actual web that was being woven in the brain as opposed to what the real cause was, because the medicines that they came up with did not apply. And so there's an example of where the right idea didn't break through somehow in that 5 years. But let me give you, but you may think, oh, in software maintenance, we don't have such problems. And I'd like to give you an example of where we do. And I take this example from a friend to my left, Václav, who did some research in the area of object-oriented programming. And that was to essentially do a study of object-oriented programming as opposed to functional design. And he proposed, and he applied this to a particular application for which he obtained a strange result and a controversial result. And on the other hand, as usual, he did a careful construction job of the experimental case study that essentially proved his result. So there was no question about the validity of that study. And what he found was, for that particular application area, the functional design actually had better maintenance, lower costs. And as you might imagine, there'd be a little bit of a pushback from the field at that time, because after all, object-oriented programming had been justified partially by the fact that its maintenance would be better. The maintenance would be better for object, and of course in general that was true. But nevertheless, he found an important exception that needed to be aired so that, we don't think we know all the answers. And he submitted his initial paper on the topic, and it was rejected. He went on to revise those papers and submit 2 more, and they were rejected. And so therefore, he didn't give up. He kept at it. He submitted 1 more, and fortunately, he had an editor and reviewers that had more of an open mind, that were willing to look at what he had done and not just make a cursory decision. Oh, that can't be. And so my plea to you today, and the challenge for you today, is if you're an author and you're writing in a controversial area, brave, go for it. But if you're a editor of a journal, or editor or one of the program chairs at a conference, or if you're one of the reviewers, please keep an open mind. Make sure you read the papers and don't make up your mind before you see all the results in that paper, because maybe that's a great idea. So I'll stop.
Lastly, at the end there is Václav Rajlich, and he was a member of the very first steering committee. He was also a program co-chair in 1991 in Zvegintzov, and program general chair in Orlando 1992. And he actually, of a workshop held at the CSM in 1992, he had a workshop on program comprehension. That's really what sparked and spawned the series of WPCs, IWPC, ICPC, and so on. And so Václav's actually going to also kind of continue similar to the theme, challenges, research directions, future, possibilities and opportunities.
thank me for kind remarks. Okay, this is my slide about the past. I was privileged to be in leadership of this conference from 1991 to 2005, and in those years I had a number of positions. The biggest thing which I would like to remember is I met and worked with a number of marvelous people who knew what they are doing, and at the same time there were great personalities and good friends all over the world. So those are the good years. Now I would rather look a little bit to the future. You know, we old timers, right, have to hand off the baton. So what is the baton? I would say that evolution and maintenance are the bulk of software engineering. This group is consolidated, and it's actually positioned at the center of the current software engineering issues. This community can solve actually the most pressing software engineering issues. This is my opinion, and it's capable and has that opportunity. This is a staged model of software life cycle, and if you look at it, right, big part of it is software evolution, where new functionality is added to software growth, right? Then software maintenance or servicing is the stage after that, when software is still being kept afloat. But when you look at this graph, this conference covers basically most of this part, right? There's a little bit before, a little bit after, but the bulk of software engineering is actually in topics of this conference. Evolutionary software development in particular is now a center of software engineering, and here I have just an overview of some software evolutionary development processes. It's a kind of incomplete list. For example, iterative programming, iterative development, where development is consisting of iterations with stated goals. Agile development is a specific kind of it, where those iterations are very short. Safeguarded development for safety critical software, where developers cannot commit on their own, they have to go through some approval process. Open source development is another example of that. Inner source development is using open source techniques within the company for proprietary software. Directed development is the development where managers assign specific tasks to specific developers. Exploratory development is the development which does not have any requirement specifications. People do evolution based on the ideas which are trying. So this ESD agenda is to study both successful and unsuccessful ESD processes. There is a number of them, enhance them, and perhaps create even new ones. Right? There are certain practices which are used in some of these processes, and using those practices as building blocks into new processes is also another path to the future development. And this community is well positioned to do this research, which could basically impact software development in a major way. Another model which I would like to present is a phased model of software change, which consists of initialization, in other words, requirements, then concept location, in other words, find what needs to be changed, impact analysis, which basically finds how big is the change, and refactoring, which is preparing for the change, actualization, which is doing the change, post-factoring, which is clean-up, conclusion, which is commit, right? Kind of natural process. Again, agenda, which is related to this process, is all those phases require additional research, impact analysis in particular. We know very little about that. We also need seamless IDE, which will support software change. It's kind of painful to do it in current IDEs, so these phases do not fit together. Another thing which I would like to bring up, this is a layman by Jan Sustru, currently published. He's convinced that current graduates have no education or training in software development. Right? The intensive hacking and invoking other people's libraries. It's a question how long community will allow us to educate people in this way, right? And we actually have the answer, right? This evolutionary software development can be taught. This is a schema of 14-week semester, which teaches this evolutionary software development. This yellow part on the left side is the space model software change. Undergraduates who never did any development are capable of learning it. So I would like to finish this exhortation, think big, right? This community can solve the core software engineering issues, right? It's positioned properly, it's developing techniques. And of course, we have to be careful, right? This is not given that we are going to be the ones who will make that contribution. There are those pressures, to concentrate on small topics, right? But I think we can do it. If you want to hear more about some of these issues, there is a citation of the paper from May in Hyderabad. They gave me more time to review. So, and with this, I will finish.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, the entire panel. It's quite amazing the different perspective we heard from this panel and the wisdom and insight we heard here. We are basically out of time, but still would like to continue with, say, 5 minutes of questions. And then this is a discussion started. We have a big banquet tonight, and hopefully you will take this opportunity to interact with these pioneers tonight and acknowledge them, thank them for the great job they did over 2 decades ago. So any questions, please line up behind the microphones standing there, in the middle there. Any questions for the panel? You have about 5 minutes.
Stop the panel.
Yes, sir.
Hi. It appeared from the evolution you gave.
Please introduce yourselves.
I'm Zvegintzov from the University of Antwerp. It appeared from the talks you gave that adding the I, the international, in front of the acronym of the conference was a pretty big event. Now, I was involved in the whole adding the E into the thing, but can you give a bit more an indication? Why was that challenged by the community? Because from what I heard, it was a pretty international conference from the very beginning.
Lee, you want to answer that?
Well, I can tell you that there were discussions 20 years ago about evolution and some suggestions that it ought to be added to the acronym. And nobody was brave enough, I guess, to step up, push it, because I think we've been talking about it all that time, isn't that right?
Yeah, so if you read, for example, the very first record Arnold wrote, if you go that, it's on the website. It actually says that the discussion came up should the next conference be called Maintenance and Evolution? So that was a big topic, and maybe Nicholas know or Bob know why it was not taken up at the time. I guess it was a little bit long.
Yeah.
Yes, over it.
This is Bob Arnold speaking. Realize in those days the software development waterfall model was in play, and maintenance was a known quantity relative to that software model. So if you took a more general view, evolution, which is probably a more correct view because evolution encompasses development as well as scope maintenance in a waterfall model. But I think the waterfall model and that perception back in those days was more familiar to people, and that's probably why other people wanted to go with maintenance. But I kind of like the idea of evolution myself.
Ned?
I've had the experience in this regard of being officially criticized for using the term evolution in relation to software. They point out that according to the usual scientific definition in the use of the word evolution, so the work we do in software does not qualify under that definition, that we are effectively violating the definition given in science documents and directories. We are continuing to do it, but we're trying to set a new way to give a revised and enlarged definition of evolution so that we are no longer outcasts in this regard.
Thank you. Andy?
I'm Andy Cyclone from Delft University of Technology. When you were having the first conference, I was 4 years old. Which raises the question, I think it was Ned who was saying that a lot of things have stayed the same. What is the most striking thing that has changed in the community over the last 30 years, in your opinion?
My comment would be the Internet of Things that is pending. That it started early, but the Internet made a drastic change in the way we do software work, and then because of the demands that were being made by the users of that software, and the fit of it into the organizations they work for. So this the Internet of Things, which is just starting, is the latest push in that direction.
Any other panelists want to address that?
Yes, this is Bob. To say, to me, two things. One is the international flavor of the conference. That's just tremendous. It wasn't that way early on. I think it's just tremendous so many places you've been to. And the other thing I've noticed is the repeatable infrastructure of the conference. It seems like you've got a very good formula now for putting on this conference, hosting other conferences with it, handling publicity. So if you wish to go anywhere in the world now, it's not necessarily that big of a deal. You need to get, of course, the right people and so on, but that's what impressed me.
Nicholas?
Well, I've been away for about 7 years. The slides are much better. I really and also, I like the pragmatic focus. We had huge struggles at the beginning because people would continually come and address the conference and say, well, I have a system which will make maintenance go away, I'll make evolution go away. But I don't hear that here, and I really enjoyed the presentations I've heard here.
Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike Godfrey, University of Waterloo. I'm also a current steering committee member. Let's pretend I'm the devil, and I can promise you, another 30 years of active, productive research, but you got to work in software maintenance and evolution. What topics would you be diving into based on what you understand is happening right now?
Malcolm? That's for you.
Well, yes, difficult to answer because I haven't. I retired 5 years ago.
But you have the Durham dynasty.
Yeah. But I think if you looked at my graph, I would go into that graph and try and delve into there and find out what's happening, what we haven't researched into, which I can't know at the moment. But also we need to look to see what's happening with the new software. And one of the thoughts something that struck me about 3 months ago was that when we programmed in the 1950s, which I didn't because I didn't start programming until the 60s. It was one man and one machine. And then, that one man, or one person I should say, was usually scientists, so they were solving scientific problems. And then we started to get bigger machines, we got into the commercial world, we got more functionality in our software, and we had to have teams. So things got more and more complex. Our code got more complex, our systems got more complex, our teams got more complex. And what struck me now is that we're almost coming full circle in that we're getting apps now coming along which have one functionality, like the scientists. The scientists would solve one problem back in the 50s. Now we're having apps that try and give you one solution to one problem. And my thoughts are we now going through yet another cycle? So I actually was going to talk about today cycle, what cycle? Because are we going through another cycle now where our apps are becoming more complex and the apps will have to be developed by more than one person, and we'll be going back to where we were in the 70s and 80s where we'll get much more complexity. So even infinitely more complexity than we've had before. So I think that we should watch out what's happening. And that's one of the things that I'd like to look at, is to see how our perception of software has changed over time. Ed?
Yes. I've been retired also. I've been retired 20 years.
Oh, wow. I look forward to that.
Yes, but I have an answer for a person who may regard it rather odd, and that is robotics. Because we are already at the verge of having robots that can perform human functions. I predict that we will eventually push off software maintenance and also much software development onto robots. And the robots will be ones that we treat with language, English, French, German, whatever, just as we presently treat people, so that we, as people, get rid of the problems of doing it, but the robots have to adjust. But the robots also will have the ability to rebuild their brains. We already have that started with the aid of some computer technology, and we'll continue that, but that we'll have the computer technology side taken over by the robots in time.
Last question, Gabby.
Gabby Superman, the research. Mike asked about the future. I want to ask about these past 30 years. If you were asked about the most significant breakthrough in software maintenance, what would it be?
Well, I'll start with that. I think the most significant breakthrough was not actually anything to do technically or managerially with software maintenance. It was the fact that we brought it to the attention of, in my perspective, the academic world, but also I think the industrial world actually owned up to the fact that they did have a problem and they wanted to do something about it. Because in the early days, I said when we first set up our centre for software maintenance, we got lots of industrialists coming in because they were desperate to talk to somebody and to talk to each other. They didn't do that. They had never had a forum to do that. So to me, the breakthrough has been this sort of awareness of the issues and the way forward.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, Václav, that's
I would
that's
say
it.
the biggest breakthrough, which has not necessarily happened here in this conference, is this emergence of evolutionary software development. There used to be a time when waterfall dominated everything, and everything that was not requirements, design, and so on was lumped into maintenance, and this agile movement and open source movement, it became obvious to just tell everybody that software has to be developed in such a way that there is an existing and running application by every additional features to it. That's basically only workable when you want to develop software, and I believe that this realization a huge base. And back when I started with this conference, we were very much on kind of defensive. We were really fitting, we were people complained of grants, lack of recognition, difficulty getting papers published. This all has suddenly changed. Many of our problems are the same problems as
So, please join me and thank this wonderful panel for the Also, we'd like to thank Bob Arnold on the phone. Thank you very much, Bob, for participating. And now, you heard the challenge from Gary Silverman, from Mike Godfrey, and the questions I asked right off the bat at the beginning. This great discussion started for the banquet tonight. Talk about it on your table about this. Also, introduce yourself to these distinguished panelists and thank them for what they started and what you now live in, right? Finally, tonight, I know Keith, who is also a pioneer here. He's a little young, but he's a pioneer. We'll love that. We're going to have an open microphone tonight. And I challenge each and every one of you to step up to the microphone and tell us about your favorite anecdote of the last 30 years of software maintenance. I'm sure each and every one of you has one, including panelists. So that's the channel, and Keith is going to go first. Right, Keith? Yes. Finally, I would like to thank Kenny Wong. He collected a lot of this material for his website that you saw. Hopefully, you all will read it. Read it for tonight for the quiz.
If you're sitting at a table with a pioneer.
Well, there's actually a table reserved for the pioneer. So the soccer game is in about 15 minutes over there at Beacon Hill Park. I hope many of you will come and at least cheer if you don't play. And the banquet starts at 7:30 sharp.